Thank you very much, Veronica, for sharing, underscoring yet another important insight to the reason we're here today.
No problem.
Now we're going to bring our conversation to the floor, front and center, just to kind of do some, we'll just trade some questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience as well. Are we ready?
I think I'm ready. Yep.
Are you?
There you go. Hello.
To go?
Yes.
Okay. As we continue to put resources into promoting STEM to girls, we must address the issues brought up by the Me Too conversation and Julianne's research. So this question I'm going to address to Veronica. Let's see here, Veronica. Since the Me Too, since you brought that up in my notes here, since the Me Too and Time's Up movements brought the issues of sexual harassment, sexual violence, and gender equity center stage. Again, how has this movement, or did it help or did it harm? How has it affected females in STEM? Do we have any current findings or solutions, potential solutions?
Well, I think the most current findings are from one of Dr. Rutherford's, Julianne's.
You can call me Julie.
Yeah, you know.
We know each other.
We know each other. So, work is by jump-starting these conversations, we can start to hold institutions accountable for the responsibility that they have to provide safe workspaces, whether that's at a conference, in a lab on campus, or at a field site in Guatemala.
And that's great, because I know in my space, in the sports male-dominated world, I know that it has really been difficult because we need male mentors, and for the most part, when I ask, they put their hands up. It's like, no, I don't want to step over that. I'm not sure of the boundaries.
Well, there's pretty solid research that shows that men were not mentoring women at any higher rate than they were 18 months ago. So when men put their hands up and say, I'm going to opt out of mentoring women or going out to dinner with them or being in closed doors, they weren't doing that in the first place. So this is just for me, it's just an excuse for men to opt out of something they were already opting out of.
Okay.
Can I add?
Please
So
do.
I think that's absolutely the wrong solution, is to say, well, then we won't mentor women. It is convenient, and it taps into already, I think, existing biases about mentoring women and women's position within academic science. There was a study not too long ago that showed that if you look at, as a baseline, men mentored by men, women mentored by men publish the least number of papers. Women mentored by women publish a little bit more than women mentored by men, but still fewer than men mentored by men. The ones with the best outcome are men mentored by women. So there's some sort of deficit in the kinds of mentoring that women are getting from male mentors. And what I'm hoping is that in this movement, in this kind of moment that has become a national conversation, that men who will become mentors are seeing that they have a space to step into and a responsibility to step into that space.
And I concur. I think that's, like you said, we need the men as well, and that's what we try to encourage. But it has been a difficult conversation on behalf of the men.
There are some great men who I have seen a lot of men on campus who are wonderful mentors. Mm-hmm. I've had men who are mentors, but I think I always question when a man says, I can't mentor women anymore because of Me Too. I want to ask them, well, how many women have you been mentoring previously?
Okay, so another scapegoat. Okay, so Dr. Rutherford, I know I ask you in our conversations, I mean, Julianne, Dr. Rutherford,
Julianne,
which, Julianne,
yes,
okay.
thank you.
This question, we'll start with you, and feel free to kind of chime in. What do you think it would take to achieve a fair and just environment for all females in STEM or those aspiring for careers, particularly women of color?
Well, that's a big question. I think, it comes down to will. It comes down to a commitment, an institutional commitment, and an individual sort of mentoring commitment. I think too often the model has been, for women generally and women of color, the notion of toughen up, be twice as good, lean in, take your space. And the problem is power doesn't cede space. It doesn't just sort of give that space really easily. And so where I'm seeing the conversation shift and the action shift is institutions taking more responsibility. And I will say, and I was talking earlier, that I've given some version of this talk or presentation, and usually in the beginning it was just students in the room. And then I started seeing sometimes more faculty would come, mostly all women. More recently, I've been seeing more of a mix of faculty and students and men and women. And then more recently, starting to see administrators in the room. I think it's this conversation and the implications for what it means for diversity and inclusion, which is a bigger conversation that this sits in, is filtering to the top. It is rising to the top. And the reality is there is movement that needs to come up from the grassroots. It needs to be met in good faith by movement from the top. So I think that it's harder to shift that. It's much easier to say to individual people and give them advice. Okay, this is what you should do. These are the things you should say. This is how you should approach your mentor. But if the system in which that interaction is taking place isn't ready for that interaction, then it's really hard to make much movement. Diversifying the scientific workplace means having more mentors of color. It means having more queer mentors. It means having more disabled mentors. It means having a broader range of people that can represent the people that we say in our mission statements and our diversity strategic plans that we want inside our doors within the academy. So it's a multi-level process. I don't have a single answer to it, but it involves will from people with power.
And I agree. I think it's corporate responsibility. I was just with the Deloitte company, international, and they have a big mission for inclusion, diversity. And I think you have bigger companies and universities paying, just really, I'm going to lean towards the optimist that, there's room for all of us to grow and contribute to this conversation and this effort. Did you want to?
I'm just agreeing with you.
Okay.
Yes, there's lots of room to grow.
Okay, we can always use more encouragement to keep up the conversation. And one other question, and this is for both of you, so no one gets out of this. And it's regarding a call to action. We're sitting here, and I know we have an audience here. Everybody is just looking for something to take as a takeaway. If you had a call to action, in light of what findings, research, what would that be, Julianne?
Well, there are many levels of action. What I would charge everyone in this space to do is look at your own lab group. If you're in a lab group, look at your own workspace, your team. And for those in leadership too, do your folks in leadership look like the membership of the rest of your group? Probably they don't, most likely. Most likely the leadership of your organization is pretty male and pretty white. And so I'm asking those pretty male and pretty white leaders at the top to sort of take an internal audit within their group, look at the literature, read the NASEM report, read one of my papers, and see what kinds of practices are you enacting that maybe put up barriers, put up obstacles. Are you in one of those spaces where somebody says something and you treat it like a joke? Because we're a lighthearted, fun-loving group of people and everybody should just be able to take a joke. Or are you recognizing that that actually is sexual harassment, or that actually is potentially racist behavior? We have to kind of get over ourselves, and we have to get over centering our feelings and recognize that we have a responsibility as leaders to really be honest about our own leadership and our own the barriers that we are putting in place for our trainees and for the people that we're trying to mentor. So it's kind of a personal call to action that we all have the power to take that kind of personal audit and take it earnestly and in good faith.
So I'm sitting here thinking about, so my Saturday, I'm going to completely nerd out and be at C2E2, which is like a little mini Comic-Con. And C2E2, when you walk in, there are huge signs that talk about consent. And because it's a comic pop culture con, people are going to dress like comic book characters, and we all know comic book characters don't wear a lot of clothes. So there are people of all stripes wearing very little clothing. And a few years ago, there was a lot of talk about just people just coming up and grabbing people. I had to take a picture with you, Wonder Woman, and just grabbing people. So now is a clear policy when you walk into that space, you do not touch another person, attendee, without their consent. How is it that a pop culture comic book conference has a better consent policy than a lot of spaces where we do our work, where we do our science? So it's just always peculiar. But I think it also goes back to the idea that culture, in a larger sense, is what pushes us. And that sometimes, yes, when we're in academia, we just kind of, this is how we've always done it. And culture changes faster, and academics will just be bowled over by this culture change if we don't get on board.
Thank you both for sharing that. Now, I know we've had a lecture-style presentation along with our conversations. I think at this time we can go ahead and open it up to the audience to kind of be interactive and share some of share some insight from this wonderful group.
Hello, my name's Amy. So I wanted to talk about power imbalance, especially with tenure. What do you see as, first of all, a lot of tenured professors, there's little impetus to correct the issue because it's slap on the wrist, or they don't have to comply with development procedures to get them, compliant. So what do you see in the future for institutions to be able to strip tenure in the event of harassment?
I think that's a really important barrier, right? I'm speaking as a tenured professor. So from that side, I'm a big fan of tenure, but so tenure, for those in our audience who may not know, it's sort of it's like a job for life. It's more nuanced than that, but essentially you get promoted, you become an associate professor, and then they can't fire you. The problem with that is that it bakes in a very convenient opportunity to abuse power. And I can't remember, like somewhat recently, I don't know if anybody remembers, but there was actually a case of somebody having tenure stripped gosh, where was it? But because of kind of persistent harassment claims, well, investigations that were found to be substantiated. Was that like at I feel like it was nearby,
Nearby?
or no?
I thought it was California.
Oh, maybe it was California. Because too often what will happen is you'll see that there are these repeat offenders who are tenured and or they bring in a lot of grant money. And so they are allowed to resign. And then it's written off as an HR issue, confidential. The file is sealed, and it can't be then used against them. So, one of the things that comes out of the National Academies study is that what's needed is a series of transparent and escalating consequences, with the stripping away of tenure being one of those, being a cause for taking away tenure. And what we've seen in the past is that people have lost tenure over research misconduct, so falsifying results, sort of misappropriating grant money, but very like a very serious breach of the tenure protection is falsifying your data. And so we've seen people lose tenure over that. And so one of the kind of cultural shifts is caring as much about sexual misconduct. And broadly, because I want to really highlight that we're also talking about gender discrimination. It's not just this sort of classic chasing around the desk scene that you're thinking about with harassment. But having that rise to the level of a punishable or untenurable offense, the mechanics of doing that and the faculty will behind that and the administrative will behind something like that, I think is going to be challenging. But just recently, I mean, it was kind of a big deal that somebody lost tenure in their job because of that, which makes them very difficult to move on from that. We have a system of protections that too often let people move from place to place.
We have an online question.
Oh, yeah.
Should STEM inclusiveness be part of graduate school training?
Should
STEM inclusiveness. Training? Or STEM, okay.
STEM inclusiveness a part of
Graduate school.
Graduate?
Should STEM inclusiveness be part of graduate school training?
Yes, if I'm interpreting the question correctly. There's a lot of things that go into what STEM inclusiveness can be and look like. One of the things that I have definitely seen over my, I want to say, I think it was Purdue, used to have a theater troupe that would do skits to train TAs and graduate assistants to help them identify when something was happening in the classroom where they should have stepped in, or in the lab. So, because when you are a graduate student, you are running a class, and you need to learn how to identify when you have the power and can stop something from happening.
Yeah, I think that's so important, is to recognize, it's sort of kind of back to the call to action piece, is that in any given set of interactions, you may be the one holding power, even if you are the graduate student. And so having that sort of built into training and have it threaded through, so it's not just a diversity seminar, but just have it threaded through about community values, community behavior, and understanding roles and responsibilities in any kind of power differential situation, I think is hugely important. A movement that we've been talking a lot about in anthropology, I think less so in STEM, but we're trying, is the idea of decolonizing your syllabus. And what that means is, are we just assigning in our readings, and as graduate students, we sort of assign the same readings that we ourselves learned were the canon for our topic. So this idea that we are still assigning the same papers, the same kind of key texts that were written by white folks and men and people who are, kind of coming from a Eurocentric tradition of science and inquiry. How can we diversify our readings, again, so it's not just a training seminar, but it's really threaded through how we present knowledge and recognize who produces knowledge, who's allowed to produce knowledge, what knowledge we recognize as valid. So I think there are many levels in graduate training where we can introduce this idea of inclusivity and kind of cultural literacy.
Oh, we need the microphone for the recording. Sorry.
Hi. So one of the organizations I work with is Expanding Your Horizons. You may be familiar with it. So it's an organization that we host annual conferences for middle school girls ages or grades 6 through 8 to expose them to STEM opportunities and careers. Our conference is actually next weekend. But one of the things that I kept thinking about while you were both talking is how it's not just sexual harassment, it's more subtle forms of gender discrimination. And during these STEM conferences, we focus primarily on STEM disciplines and giving them access to STEM opportunities that they may not be aware of otherwise, just so that they know that those jobs exist. And we also provide resources for the parents. But I'm wondering, what are some things that we can do with that age group to help them recognize gender discrimination and kind of know how to engage in behaviors to get away from, falling prey to that discrimination, or set themselves up for success?
They know it. I have a 15-year-old, and she knew it. She knew what subtle gender discrimination was, and I don't think it's just because she's my daughter. And yeah, so I think they know it, and I really do think that is part of why we see this huge dip in interest in STEM, particularly at that middle school time, because these girls are growing, their bodies are changing, and all of a sudden they're walking down the street and some guy who looks like their grandfather is whistling at them or catcalling them. And then all of a sudden the boys in their class are paying a different kind of attention to them. All of these things kind of add up, and they don't know how to manage it. So they know it. So I think it's not so much about helping them know what gender discrimination looks like, but how to manage that. And that it's not okay for someone to catcall them on the street. Someone did that to my daughter once when she was probably like 10, and I went off on them, and and she was probably very embarrassed about that. But particularly, I think that especially this generation, they are aware of what's going on. They just don't always have the language and don't always have the tools. So I think if you were to focus towards that, it would have a more rich conversation as opposed to this is what gender discrimination looks like.
We have an online question again. Do you know any institution that is a pioneer or took leadership in combating sexual harassment?
I couldn't. Can you say
Kind of lost you if you can come closer, kind of got lost and.
Yeah.
A little echoey, yeah.
It sounds fine over there, but here. Yeah. Do you know any institution that is a pioneer or took leadership in combating sexual harassment?
In combating sexual harassment, a pioneer.
Oh. No. I mean, as a university or something, no, I don't.
I'll say that I feel like they're all just struggling with this. And part of the contextualization of universities, specifically colleges and universities struggling with this, is that they were struggling with how to deal with campus rape before we started talking about dealing with harassment from professors, all of these sorts of things. So I really feel like our universities are just flailing around trying to figure out what to do. Not that that's any excuse for them to not be leaders, but are just so many things that the culture, again, the culture is changing. We're not taking it anymore, that whole thing. And now leaders, university leaders don't always know how to handle it. So I was thinking about the end of tenure. Well, it's very rare for someone who had raped somebody to be expelled from a university. And that's a student, much less to have a faculty person, somebody who has tenure and is bringing in multi-million-dollar research grants to be denied tenure or have their tenure stripped from them. So that's the kind of range that universities are working with. And if they can't even take the star quarterback and remove them from campus, yeah, so there's not a leader.
I think I absolutely agree with that, and what universities and other entities have been better at are implementing policies and over-relying on things like Title IX. Title IX is great. The process of reporting and seeing remedy of harassment or assault through the Title IX process by many accounts is really painful, not satisfying, does not yield a satisfying outcome, and often what you'll see is a perpetrator who has been, the punishment is, well, don't teach any classes this year. And what I always say is that for professors at a big research institution, we kind of want to go and do our research. So being told can't teach.
Uh-oh. You broke the mic.
It's on, but so let me see, is it working now? Oh, it is working now, okay. It needed a little reset, okay. What was I saying?
For now. Teaching, yes.
Teaching. So,
No teaching
this,
as punishment.
yeah, I mean, this comes back to like the kind of escalating, transparent kinds of consequences that that we haven't seen a lot of movement on in terms of an institution being a pioneer. So I really wish I could remember the specifics of this recent case where this faculty member was stripped of tenure, because it was incredibly rare. So I'd like to give credit to that institution, but I don't remember who it was. But I don't know that it is reflective of a whole shift, or if the act was so egregious that they had to act. But where I hope to see movement, and I think it's a great value of the National Academies report, is that okay, maybe we've done what we can in terms of reporting mechanisms and making everybody a mandated reporter. So a mandated reporter is, if a student comes to me and says, I've had this experience, I need to talk to you about it, I have to stop them and say, I'm sorry, I'm a mandated reporter. I am required by my university in Title IX to report anything you're going to tell me. I am required to report it to the authorities. Whether you really want me to or not, I am required to. So are you sure you really want to tell me anything? Well, that's so welcoming. That really fosters an environment where people want to seek out help, because I have to tell them that I'm going to have to tell. I don't think that that's the way, but that is what we're required to do. Whether we do it or not, that's a private matter, but that's what we're required to do. And I don't think that that is the way forward. I don't think that is pioneering or revolutionary. And so, I wish I had a more positive answer, because I would like for there to be, but we have a lot of work.
Because we are at a prestigious university, and we so happen to have a high-ranking official that's sitting right here, while he may not be able to give us the inner workings, but maybe be able to speak to how Northwestern University is struggling or handling this, if it so be.
Okay, so I'm Jay Walsh. I'm the Vice President for Research here at Northwestern. A couple things to say. First of all, the mandated reporter is a law. So you know, it's nice that it's part of our policy. It's just the law. So we follow that. My guess is at UIC, it's the same sort of deal.
Oh, it's a key part of our training.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Yes.
It's good to follow the law. So, I can say I'll say a few more things about what we're doing here. I would say you're right in the fact that there are culturally challenges. So a few things, the Title IX process, I don't run it here. I have certainly had interactions with that process. And it is a challenged process. It's a challenge for those who come forward. It's also a challenge for those in the administration who have to work with it. The due process part of our culture puts us in a challenging position as far as that's concerned. There's also varying amounts by which those who come forward with allegations want to be known. So, sometimes they don't want to be known, sometimes they don't mind. So that puts us in a challenging position as to how much we publicize these sorts of things. The cases that you're talking about, the most prominent two cases of people losing tenure were in California. I would say that those of us who are in positions such as mine know of more than just those cases. But that does speak to the issue that I just brought up, which is how much do you make this known and how much don't you? How much do you have the person who brought forward an allegation, have to live through that in a more public way? So, these are all conversations that have to happen and don't always become public and known to everybody. So one of the things that certainly I see is the cultural challenges. I see a country, frankly, that's going through, and maybe society larger than just country, because Me Too is certainly larger than the United States. I see us going through this phase where we're having a challenging time trying to figure out how to move some of these issues, in the particular case here, sexual harassment, forward. And I would love to hear from you what you see as sort of these sort of macro issues in our culture, in our society, and how that overlays with what we're talking about here, which is sexual harassment, largely in STEM areas, which is what you've talked about, although it hits academia more broadly.
Thank you.
Well, I think it's important to remember that, I think both Veronica and I are making that point that what we're talking about in STEM isn't unique to STEM at all. It's not unique to academia. But academia has some historical peculiarities, that it's very hierarchical, there's tenure, it's very much an apprentice system, so it's a very sort of old Eurocentric kind of way of you are fully dependent on somebody who is in charge of your entire career. And that's not always the case for other disciplines, but it's very much a feature of academia. So I think one of the frustrating aspects of addressing, because I agree with all of your points, they are all accurate. There is upheaval at all levels of this, right? And one of the things that we can look at and ask a more broad cross-societal kind of question is, how do we make people feel more comfortable to come forward? We do a bad job of it. We make the processes really cumbersome and really punitive, and I understand that those who are accused feel that as well. But we can't get that far if we don't have people feeling like they can come forward. And then if they aren't coming forward, or they feel that they need a lot of shelter, then we don't hear what happens. And so it further silos it off. So we had to ask ourselves that question. How do we make it safer, more welcoming to come forward? And then, how do we redress the wrong that has been done in a way that is satisfactory to everyone? I don't have an answer for that. And I think where we are in academia and where we are in society is a really messy place. We're in a period of cultural upheaval, and I don't think that there are clear-cut answers. And I wouldn't be comfortable saying, like, here's what needs to happen. Because, I can say what needs to happen, but I don't have an expectation that it will, So that's my response to that. I don't know if you...
Yeah, there's no easy answers. When I think about the whole spectrum of issues on campus, from undergraduates harassing, assaulting each other, to faculty, all the whole way down, it's just a chaos in some ways. But I think where it has to change is valuing the survivor more than anything else. I know too many people who have dropped out of college, and I'm not talking about students at UIC, I'm talking about peers, because that's what was done a few years ago. If you were assaulted, you were said, well, maybe you should leave for a semester or two to get your head straight. Or if you don't want to see him on the quad, wait till he graduates. How is that fair and just at all? Those sorts of things. So, and so then if the process is so damaging and traumatizing, no one is going to come forward. So it goes back to what Julianne was saying, just how do we make this process more humane and supportive and with an eye towards justice?
I think, I know there are other questions, but this is important. So I think part of it is, because I recognize that mandated reporting is the law. And what I think, and the National Academies study also suggests that we need to move beyond just this compliance-driven mission, which is, this is the law, this is what you do, this is how you report. Because when I take my Title IX training as a faculty member, the whole process of mandated reporting is explained to me. And who I would go to, and here are the scenarios, and all the scenarios are student on student. There's very little of the actual power differential stuff. There's nothing about, there's no questions or training in, what would foster an environment of inclusivity? How would you recognize and intervene? There's no bystander training. It's all about, the law is you are a mandated reporter. We can do better. That's an easy place. I haven't seen it done, but it's an easy place to target.
And while we continue the mandated reporter thing is just like the bane of my existence, I feel, because I'm just always in conversation with undergraduates and then having to stop them, not that it happens on a daily basis, but to be like, whoa, if you're telling me something about you, I'm gonna have to report it. But if something happened to your classmate, your roommate, your cousin in another state, let's talk about that. I don't have to report that. Or you saw it in a movie. Yeah. How do we handle that? Those sorts of things. The mandated reporting comes from the fact that campuses were hiding these things. So this was, unfortunately, something that was demanded by grassroots, from feminists, but it just doesn't, in a day-to-day basis, it doesn't work out.
Yeah. And it's so driven the whole compliance culture and not actually shifting. I think it came from a great place.
Yes.
And I understand it in terms of transparency. Yes. But the actual implementation of it and what it does is it's silencing and distancing, and it isn't changing anything. And we've had these mechanisms in place. We're not seeing less sexual harassment. We're not seeing less discrimination. It's not like, oh, these are in place and these things are just falling away and they're no longer a problem.
And so
it's not working.
one of the only places on campus to do confidential reporting is our campus advocacy network office, but and I know for a fact it's not just at our campus that they're under-resourced. So.
Hi.
Hello.
This is going to take me a while to articulate, but my husband, he's from Nicaragua, next to Honduras, and he came here during the revolution. He was very young, and then his uncle is big medical researcher in Nicaragua, so his work gets recognized in France. And something that I think is an issue is, you know, my husband's very, very bright, and I know there's a lot of children of color as well who are passed over for gifted education, and because gifted research is such a new thing. And part of the problem with reporting incidents is, you know, when women report things like that they got sexually assaulted or whatever, and then they try to go into STEM fields like healthcare, for example, if they say that in the past they were assaulted or harassed, whatever it was, raped, sometimes you have people who they don't understand gifted education or emotional intelligence, and they just kind of look at the woman as a stigma. So they think, oh, maybe she has a mental illness. I don't think she should go into this field. And so there's that kind of discrimination in the workplace. And, you know, it's only very recent that in like gifted education for kids, they figured out that there's kids that are twice gifted. So maybe in one area they have, you know, ADD or some kind of mental illness, but another area they're very advanced. So I think this would be an issue with the reporting, is that let's say a woman comes forth and it's more publicly known that she went through something, people will just assume, okay, she has a mental illness. And then another comment I wanted to make, my husband was in Seattle, and Seattle, there's much less Hispanic people in tech. So even though he's a guy, he got mistaken a lot for the custodian people. So I understand the need for exposure, especially with people of color. My mom is also brown. I just didn't inherit that. I mix. So Seattle and Silicon Valley, for those of you who have been there, there's really not a lot of people of color in the big tech companies. There just isn't. It's like a flood of Asians and white. And part of it is just, you know, people see on the news that minorities need help, but they don't realize like the really good benefits. So you have passive-aggressive racism. So you have people that they talk the talk, or they want brownie points because they say the nice things, but in their head they don't really understand the value that minorities give. They don't know about like the achievements of different minorities. So I think that's an issue as well, because in Seattle, you know, people would stare at my husband or my mom when she came to visit me, and they looked really uncomfortable, you know. So I think that exposure there is an issue. And when I go to, I'm in a graduate school for cybersecurity, and like I went to networking events in Chicago, and in Seattle they dress more simple, so I guess I look like a bum at these networking events, but I wasn't sure the dress code in Chicago. But I just noticed it's like if I laugh a lot, or if I try to network and make connections the way a guy would make jokes, people assume I'm flirting. So that's also an issue. And people will say to me that, oh, it's because men naturally are more visual creatures than women, and they think of sex every 7 seconds. They are always thinking of sex. So I think also like addressing stereotypes of men would kind of help, so that we really know how men, think.
Well,
So yeah.
I think what your comment is all summing up is that there is still a standard model of behavior that's based on a white man. And so any deviation from that impacts that, so that so brown and black men are seen as janitors as well. Being too loud, Latinas often get deducted points in terms of workplace equity because we dress too bright colors. Maybe we have lower necklines. Asian American women have stereotypes about being timid. Asian American men have stereotypes about being effeminate. So it's all about this centering of white men in our society and how we interact with everybody. And when we deviate from that, which we're all going to, because we're not all white men, and not all white men are the same, that backlash tries to keep everyone in that box. And so that's what this one of the parts of the conversation is about, is accepting the fact that some of us are going to dress very femme one day and some of us aren't. And that's okay, because we're all still scientists and we all still do great work.
So how do you network? So what's your advice for networking in this type of environment? Because it's hard to get ahead if people are always thinking they're flirting.
Yeah, I don't have an answer for that other than the fact that you just have to find other people who you can network with. And that's why it's important for, as the saying goes, skin folk actually be kinfolk, and women supporting women, and people of color supporting people of color, and all of these things, and white men stepping up and actually mentoring, supporting, and advocating for everybody. It's hard. It's going to take a long time. It's taken a long time. When Title IX was passed in 1972, people thought that was going to be the answer. Or if the answer wasn't coming very soon, that all we needed to do is get more women to major in biology and things will be hunky-dory. We're 2 generations past that, and we still are grappling with the fact that even though 60% of undergraduates are women in biology, we get to the faculty level and it's completely flipped, if not worse. But people are just like, hey, women don't want to be professors. But that's not the case.
Mm-hmm. And that's regardless of whether the woman has had a family or not. Mm-hmm. So it's not just sort of a mommy penalty. It's something about being a woman aside from maternity. So I know she has one. And
Hi, I was just wondering if any of this extra work or kind of outreach that you're doing in this area to bring awareness to this issue kind of takes away from your science as a profession and kind of affects how this is working, because it tends to be women and minority groups that do this kind of research, which is kind of a barrier and holding them back in their careers. So I was wondering if you could speak to that.
I can. It's very interesting because this was, as I kind of laid out, this wasn't a path I had planned, and it's now been, we're coming on 5 years now, and my career is very different than what I had started and what I had envisioned. And yeah, I do get pushback about when am I going to focus more on my real work. This has become my real work. My other work is also my real work, but this work is, I think those of us who do this kind of work, whatever form it takes, what people outside of it don't necessarily realize is that the emotional burden and the particularly, you end up being somebody people come and talk to, and email, and call, and message on Facebook, and message on Twitter, and message on Instagram, and it's nonstop. It's nonstop work, and that was a part of it that I was not prepared for. My other work I can turn off. I can't turn this off, and I don't want to, but even coming here today, I had to get into it. And it meant I have papers I have to write, and I have a grant that I need to put in. But this work is really important too, but it is different, and I think I've been viewed differently by some, and others have really valued it. I think others wonder when I'm gonna when am I gonna get back? Okay, yeah, it's back, right. Get back to your other work. We wanna hear more about the monkeys, which are great, and I can tell you about that some other time. But, and I feel that burden as a white woman. And so I'm not getting asked to do a whole bunch of diversity summits. I'm not getting asked to do getting asked to do that kind of heavy lifting. And I find that what I'm doing is exhausting. So I think we always have to keep in mind that it is incredibly hard, and that we do put too much of this work on the backs of Black and brown women in particular within the academy and really all workspaces. But yeah, I think it's taken a toll in some ways, personally, but it's the work, and it's definitely worth doing. And I think it's enhanced the way I approach my other science, in terms of thinking about how does my work contribute to equity? How does my work contribute to health justice? It's reframed my other scholarship in a way that I think has brought me a lot of satisfaction personally, but I think has also allowed me to engage much more richly in dialogue. That's really important. So it's not easy, but it's worth it.
We'll do one more question.
Are there any more questions? Are we?
I have plenty on here.
Okay, we'll go right ahead.
I just want to, I didn't know if we were on time. I don't know where our time is. But I wanted to add that, when I applied to graduate school right out of undergrad, I made it clear that I wanted to study both biology and women's studies. And I was told that that's not what you do. Mm-hmm. And so I didn't do it. I didn't go to grad school for biology and women's studies. And I just created this new career path. But I have also been told that because of the work I do, getting any sort of job outside of academia is probably out of the picture for me, because I'm a troublemaker. I've spent 20 years causing trouble.
I have a current mentee who is pre-med and women's studies.
Yes.
Yeah.
Do you have data from international societies? Is sexual harassment worse or better in international academic settings?
I don't have data. Somebody might, but I know that's a real challenge. It came up. I'm an international society that I'm active in. I had offered to speak about some of this stuff, and the response I got was there's the cultural difference. The cultural differences across an international society would almost preclude a universal discussion, which I didn't agree with, but I think that is a driving force behind maybe less happening internationally. But I can't speak to that specifically, but I've seen more happening in the national societies that I've been part of. Was that kind of the question? Yeah.
Is it just as prevalent elsewhere as in the US?
I don't know. I don't know that we have the data for these kinds of things from a cross-section internationally. It would be really interesting to see. We might predict that, like in Sweden, Norway, you would see less of this than you would in other more patriarchal countries, but that's an assumption, and I don't know
had that
it's
recent
true.
one where it was women in societies where they're kind of marginalized usually actually go towards STEM fields more so than women who can choose more or less. it was a really interesting study because it's exactly the opposite of what you would think.
I will add that what we don't have the, I don't think we, I agree, we don't have the data to understand this in an international perspective, but the US is still the #1 destination place to train as a scientist. So whether or not Sweden's got a handle on this or not means we are still probably one of the #1 producers of scientists around the world. So we as a nation, as a system, have to figure this out.
Right?
All right, how are we looking? Is that our final question?
Yeah, that was it. So thank you, everyone. Thank you to our great panel and our moderator.